My name is Christy Williams, and at 71 years old, I never expected to be driving myself home from major surgery. Thomas had always been such a reliable son, which made his silence that day even more confusing. When 6 unanswered calls turned into hours of waiting, I made a decision that would change everything. Renting that car, despite my weakened state, seemed necessary then. Little did I know what awaited me at the home I had helped buy. Some betrayals cut deeper than surgical wounds, but karma works in mysterious ways. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from today? Take a moment to subscribe and like this video if family loyalty matters to you. I spent 45 years as an elementary school teacher in the same district, teaching several generations of families in our small town. The children knew me as Mrs. Williams, a strict but fair presence who always had extra snacks in her desk for those who forgot their lunch. My classroom walls showcased student artwork dating back decades, and my filing cabinets held handmade cards from former students who had become parents and even grandparents themselves. My husband Jack passed away 10 years ago. A massive heart attack took him while he was mowing the lawn on a hot summer afternoon. One minute he was waving at me through the kitchen window, and the next our neighbor was pounding on my door. Just like that, my partner of 40 years was gone, leaving me alone in our family home filled with memories but also silence. After Jack died, I threw myself into helping Thomas and his family. Our only child had married Diana 12 years earlier, giving me 2 beautiful grandchildren, Lily and Jake, now 12 and 8. They lived across town in a house that was becoming too small for their growing family. When Thomas mentioned they were house hunting, I suggested a solution that seemed perfect at the time. I would sell our family home and use the proceeds to help them purchase a larger property with a detached guest house. This arrangement would allow me to be close to my grandchildren while maintaining some independence. The property they found was perfect, a beautiful 2-story colonial with a charming 1-bedroom cottage situated at the back of the acre lot. I contributed nearly 60% of the down payment, with the understanding that the guest house would be my home for the remainder of my life. The first year was wonderful. I had dinner with the family most evenings, helped Lily with her science projects, and taught Jake how to bake my famous apple pies. Diana seemed grateful for my help with the children, especially when her interior design business started taking off and required more travel. I would drive the children to school, attend their activities, and have snacks ready when they returned home. Thomas would stop by the guest house every morning for coffee before heading to his accounting firm, just to check in and chat about the day ahead. Looking back, I should have noticed the subtle changes that began approximately 6 months before my hospitalization. Diana started declining my offers to help with dinner, saying she wanted the children to experience her family recipes. Thomas began calling to cancel our morning coffee, claiming early meetings or deadlines. The grandchildren still visited, but Diana would call them back to the main house after shorter and shorter periods, citing homework or chores. One afternoon, I overheard an argument between Thomas and Diana through an open window. The words drifted clearly across the garden. Diana was saying something about the situation with your mother becoming unbearable. Thomas responded that they just needed to be patient a little longer. At the time, I assumed they were referring to some temporary frustration, perhaps my tendency to rearrange their kitchen or offer unsolicited parenting advice. I resolved to be more mindful of boundaries. Then the financial questions began. Thomas started inquiring about my savings, my pension plan, and whether I had updated my will since Jack passed. He framed these conversations as concern for my future, but something in his tone felt calculating rather than caring. During a family dinner, Diana casually mentioned a friend whose mother had moved to a beautiful retirement community, emphasizing how the mother was thriving with people her own age. Thomas nodded enthusiastically, watching my reaction. I noticed I was being excluded from family decisions. Plans for summer vacation were made without consulting my schedule despite previous traditions of traveling together. Renovations to the main house proceeded without my input, even though I had contributed to the property purchase. When I stopped by one afternoon, I discovered workers installing an expensive security system I knew nothing about. My health had always been relatively good, but the stress of the changing family dynamic began to take its toll. I started experiencing sharp pains in my abdomen, but dismissed them as stress or perhaps age-related digestion issues. I took over-the-counter remedies and tried to carry on normally, not wanting to burden anyone or confirm their apparent view that I was becoming frail. The pain became unbearable during a school concert where Lily was performing a violin solo. I managed to stay seated until her performance ended, but then had to excuse myself. In the school hallway, I collapsed, and the next thing I remember is waking up in an ambulance with a terrified Lily holding my hand. At the hospital, doctors discovered my gallbladder was severely infected and required emergency surgery. What should have been a routine procedure developed complications. My recovery was slowed by an infection extending my hospital stay to 2 weeks. During the first few days, Thomas visited daily, though usually alone or sometimes with the children for brief periods. Diana came twice, both times appearing distracted and checking her watch frequently. By the second week, Thomas was visiting every other day, always during his lunch break, limiting his stay to 20 minutes. The day before my scheduled release, Thomas assured me he would handle all the discharge arrangements. He promised to pick me up at 11 in the morning, mentioned he had prepared the guest house for my recovery, and said Diana had arranged for a home health aide to check on me daily. I thanked him, relieved that despite the recent tension, my family would be there when I needed them most. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, comforted by the thought of returning to my own space and beginning the healing process surrounded by my family. If only I had known what was actually waiting for me, I might have never left the safety of that hospital room. On my final morning in the hospital, Nurse Jenna helped me pack the few belongings that had accumulated during my 2-week stay. She folded my nightgown and robe, commenting that many patients receive new loungewear from family for their recovery period. Thomas had promised to bring me a comfortable outfit to wear home, but nothing had arrived yet. I didn't worry initially, assuming he would bring clothes when he came to pick me up at 11. Jenna raised an eyebrow when I mentioned that my family hadn't called that morning to confirm discharge plans, but she kept her thoughts to herself. By 10:30, I was fully packed and seated in a wheelchair as per hospital policy, waiting in my room. At 10:45, I called Thomas. The call went straight to voicemail. I left a cheerful message asking if he was on his way. By 11:15, with no response, I called again, and again at 11:30. By noon, I had called 6 times with no answer. I tried Diana's cell phone, which also went to voicemail after several rings. The discharge coordinator stopped by asking if my ride was delayed. I smiled through my embarrassment and assured her they would arrive soon. She wheeled me to the discharge lounge near the hospital entrance, where other patients were being greeted by family members and helped into waiting cars. One by one, the others left until I was alone in the sterile beige room. By 1:30, Nurse Jenna came looking for me during her lunch break. Finding me still waiting, her professional demeanor cracked slightly as she asked if there was anyone else I could call. The kindness in her eyes made the situation even more humiliating. I considered my options. Most of my friends were elderly themselves and not comfortable driving in midday traffic. My sister Barbara lived in Oregon, and we hadn't spoken in years following a disagreement about our mother's care. A hospital volunteer named Ruth brought me a sandwich and a cup of tea, insisting I needed to keep up my strength. 3 hours after my scheduled pickup time, I made a decision. I had an emergency credit card I rarely used. Though still weak from surgery and medication, I would find a way home myself. Ruth called a cab to take me to a nearby car rental agency. The thought of spending money on both a cab and a rental car bothered my depression-era, raised sensibilities, but I saw no alternative. The cab driver, noting my hospital wristband and careful movements, carried my small bag into the rental office and wished me well. The young man at the rental counter looked concerned when I explained my situation. My hands trembled slightly as I filled out the paperwork, and I noticed him watching me with worry. Kevin, according to his name tag, asked if I was sure I felt well enough to drive. I straightened my posture and smiled with more confidence than I felt explaining I had driven for over 50 years without an accident. He upgraded me to a car with better visibility and easier handling without charging extra. As Kevin helped me into the rental car, I remembered teaching Thomas to drive in our old station wagon. He had been so nervous gripping the wheel at precisely 10 and 2 as instructed. I had remained calm through his jerky starts and abrupt stops, offering gentle guidance rather than criticism. When he passed his driving test on the first try, his face had lit up with pride as he showed me the license. Where was that thoughtful boy now? The 15-mile drive home took all my concentration. I drove cautiously, hyper-aware of my slowed reflexes and the occasional twinge of pain from my incision. Each time my phone rang from its position in the cup holder, my heart leapt, but it was only the hospital pharmacy calling about prescription refills and then the hospital satisfaction survey team. Halfway home, I pulled into a grocery store parking lot and called my neighbor Eleanor. After pleasantries and her questions about my health, I casually asked if she had seen Thomas and Diana today. Her hesitation before answering sent a chill through me. "Well, I saw them loading up their SUV this morning. Quite a few suitcases," she said carefully. "The kids were helping carry things out." "Did they mention where they were going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "No, but Diana waved when she saw me watching. Thomas seemed in a hurry. Is everything all right, Christy?" I assured her everything was fine. Thomas must have forgotten today was my discharge day. Perhaps they'd planned a quick trip before I came home. Even as I offered this explanation, I knew it made no sense. Why would they plan a trip the day I was scheduled to return from the hospital? Back on the road, I mentally prepared explanations for the misunderstanding. Perhaps Thomas thought discharge was tomorrow. Maybe there was a work emergency. Diana could have had a client crisis. The children might have had an unexpected school event. Each scenario seemed less plausible than the last. As I turned onto our street, I noticed the landscaping at the entrance to our property had changed. The flowering cherry tree I had planted last spring had been removed, replaced with sculptural shrubs in Diana's preferred modern style. The mailbox had been replaced with a larger, more ornate version bearing only the name Stevens Thomas last name, not Williams. Something was very wrong, and for the first time that day, fear completely overtook confusion. I pulled into the driveway behind an unfamiliar black luxury SUV with dealer tags. My usual parking spot near the guest house was blocked by a large dumpster filled with what appeared to be furniture and household items. With a jolt, I recognized my reading chair and several lamps from the guest house poking out from the debris. New security cameras tracked my movement as I made my way slowly to the main house, my surgical incision protesting with each step. The walkway had been repaved with expensive flagstone that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. Seasonal flowers I had planted had been replaced with architectural grasses and minimalist rock features that matched Diana's aesthetic. When I reached the front door, I noticed the familiar brass knocker had been replaced with a digital doorbell system featuring a camera. I pressed it, but heard no sound from inside. After waiting a moment, I reached for my key. For 10 years since they moved in, I had possessed a key to their home just as they had one to the guest house, a practical arrangement for emergencies and convenience. The key would not fit in the lock. I tried again, thinking I had perhaps used the wrong key, but none of the keys on my ring worked. The locks had been changed. I knocked firmly on the door, calling out Thomas' name. Through the decorative glass panels, I could see movement inside. A small face appeared briefly at the window. Jake's unmistakable cowlick visible before he was hurriedly pulled away by an adult hand. "Lily Jake Thomas, it's Grandma." I called out, my voice stronger than I felt. "I just got back from the hospital." More movement inside, hushed voices, and then footsteps approaching the door. Rather than opening it, Thomas appeared at the second-floor window directly above the entrance. His face, so like his father's, was set in an expression I had never seen before, cold and distant. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn. "You need to leave." I stared up at him, certain I had misheard. "Thomas, I just got home from the hospital. You were supposed to pick me up. I had to rent a car." His expression didn't change. "Get out. You don't live here anymore." The words hit me like physical blows. "What are you talking about? Of course I live here. In the guest house." The appearance of Diana at the window beside him stopped my words. She had her cell phone in hand, held up as if to display it. "If you don't leave immediately, I'm calling the police. This is private property." I felt dizzy, placing one hand on the doorframe to steady myself. This made no sense. My name was on the property documents. I had paid for most of the down payment. The guest house had been specifically purchased as my residence. "Where are Lily and Jake? I need to see my grandchildren," I said, my voice breaking. Diana disappeared from the window, while Thomas remained, his gaze unflinching. "They're not your concern anymore. We have legal documentation establishing that you are not permitted on this property. A formal notice has been sent to your new address." "What new address?" "Thomas Im. Your mother. What is happening?" From neighboring houses, I could see curtains moving and faces appearing. Mrs. Abernathy from across the street had stepped onto her porch watching with undisguised interest. Eleanor emerged from her house 2 doors down, alarm evident in her rapid approach. "This isn't your house anymore," Thomas repeated. "We have sole ownership now. The guest house is being renovated for Diana's home office. Your belongings have been placed in storage." The world seemed to tilt. The physical pain from my surgery paled in comparison to the stabbing agony in my heart. My son, my only child. The person I had dedicated my life to raising and supporting was treating me like an unwanted trespasser. Worse, he had planned this, executed it while I was at my most vulnerable, and seemed to feel no remorse. My legs gave out and I sank to the ground, a wounded animal sound escaping my throat. Eleanor reached me just as Diana reappeared at the window. "The police are on their way," Diana announced, a note of triumph in her voice. She pulled Thomas away from the window and the blinds came down with a decisive snap. Eleanor helped me to my feet, her arm around my waist, taking my weight. "Come with me, Christy. You can't stay here. Not like this." I could barely walk, shock making my limbs wooden and unresponsive. As Eleanor guided me toward her house, a police cruiser turned onto our street, responding with alarming speed to Diana's call. The young officer who approached looked between me, a clearly distressed elderly woman fresh from the hospital based on my wristband and patient belongings bag, and the closed-up house with its drawn blinds. "Ma'am, the homeowners have reported a trespasser," he began awkwardly. The humiliation of explaining that the homeowner was my son, that I had lived in the guest house for years, that I had just been released from the hospital, remains one of the most painful moments of my life. Eleanor, bless her heart, produced documentation showing my previous residency, including mail, addressed to me at the guest house. The officer, looking increasingly uncomfortable, suggested this was a civil matter that would need to be resolved through proper legal channels. In the meantime, I could not enter the property if the current legal owners denied permission. He offered to speak with my son, but the house remained closed to us, Thomas and Diana refusing to come to the door. As we walked away, I looked back at the home I had helped create, where my grandchildren lived, where all my possessions and mementos were now inaccessible to me. The blinds on Jake's window moved slightly, and I caught a glimpse of his small face watching me leave. I lifted my hand in a small wave, but the blinds fell back into place. Eleanor guided me to her guest room, promising we would figure this out together. But as I sat on the edge of her floral guest bed, still wearing my hospital clothes, the magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. My son had not just forgotten me at the hospital. He had orchestrated my removal from my home, my family, and apparently from his life. I spent that first night at Eleanor's house in a fog of pain, both physical and emotional. My surgical incision throbbed, a reminder of the vulnerability that Thomas and Diana had exploited. Eleanor brought me tea and toast, neither of which I could stomach. She offered sleeping pills, but I refused, afraid to lose what little control I still possessed. Morning brought no clarity. The guest room window faced my former property, and I could see unfamiliar workmen entering the guest house carrying tools and materials. They emerged periodically with more of my belongings, adding them to the dumpster. I watched in horror as photo albums, books, and even my antique writing desk, a wedding gift from Jack, were discarded like garbage. Eleanor insisted I call my doctor, concerned about the effect of stress on my recovery. Dr. Lawrence had been my physician for nearly 20 years, treating everything from bronchitis to grief after Jack's death. His nurse put me through immediately when I called, and his familiar voice provided the first sense of stability since leaving the hospital. "Christy, what's going on? I received a call from Thomas 2 days ago saying you'd decided to move to an assisted living facility directly after discharge. He requested your medical records be transferred to their staff physician." The revelation sent ice through my veins. So this had been planned even before my surgery. Thomas had been laying groundwork, creating a narrative to explain my sudden absence. "I haven't agreed to any facility," I told Dr. Lawrence, my voice shaking. "Thomas abandoned me at the hospital yesterday. When I finally got home, they had changed the locks and told me I don't live there anymore." The silence on the other end spoke volumes. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Christy, I'm going to have my nurse schedule you for an immediate follow-up. I need to check your incision site and make sure you're getting proper post-operative care. And I think we need to document what's happening. This sounds like elder abuse." The term elder abuse had never occurred to me. That was something that happened to confused nursing home residents or vulnerable seniors who were isolated from family. Not to me, a retired professional with a sound mind and a son who had always been loving and attentive. After hanging up, Eleanor convinced me to eat something while we figured out our next steps. Over scrambled eggs that tasted like cardboard, she revealed observations she'd been reluctant to share previously. They've had a lot of visitors in the past month, men in suits carrying briefcases. I thought they were colleagues of Thomas, but they didn't look like accountants. And Diana has been showing the inside of your guest house to different people. I assumed they were getting decorating ideas, but now. She looked uncomfortable. And last week, when you were still in the hospital, I saw Thomas at First National Bank. I was there depositing my Social Security check. He was in the manager's office with a woman who looked like you. From behind, same hair color and build. She was signing documents. Alarmed, I called the bank immediately. Martin Bailey, the bank manager, had known me for decades. I had been his 6th grade teacher and later helped his daughter apply for college scholarships. When his secretary tried to block my call, I insisted with a firmness that surprised even me. Martin sounded guarded when he came on the line, but his tone changed when I explained my situation. There was a long pause before he spoke. "Christy, someone accessed your accounts last week. They had power of attorney documentation and proper identification. 2 of your certificates of deposit were cashed out, incurring substantial penalties. Your checking account was emptied except for $50, and a safe deposit box in your name was accessed. My safe deposit box contained my original birth certificate, Jack's, life insurance policy, our marriage certificate, and several pieces of jewelry I'd been saving for Lily when she turned 16. The violation went beyond money. It was my history, my identity, my legacy to my granddaughter. Eleanor drove me to the county records office that afternoon, her ancient Buick creeping along at exactly the speed limit. The clerk was initially reluctant to help, citing privacy rules, but when I presented my driver's license and explained I was checking my own property records, she relented. What we discovered confirmed my worst fears. 3 months ago, the deed to the property had been transferred, removing my name entirely. A document purportedly signed by me had relinquished all claims to the property in exchange for a lump sum payment, which, according to bank records, had never been deposited in any of my accounts. The notary's stamp belonged to Diana Brother, who worked at a law firm in the next county. More disturbing still, a second mortgage had been taken out on the property 6 weeks ago, with my signature on the documents as a co-owner. The proceeds, nearly $200,000, had been withdrawn immediately. The paperwork showed it had been used for home improvements and medical expenses, though I knew no legitimate medical bills would amount to such a sum. My hand trembled as I looked at the signatures. They were close approximations of my handwriting, but missed subtle details. The loop on my Y was wrong, and the cross on my T was placed differently than my usual signature. The forgery was convincing enough for officials who didn't know my handwriting intimately, but it wasn't mine. Looking through the additional documents, we discovered a power of attorney form allegedly signed by me 2 months before my surgery. It granted Thomas complete control over my financial, medical, and legal decisions, citing early cognitive decline as the reason. This form had been notarized by the same brother-in-law and included a letter from a Dr. Wilson attesting to my diminished capacity. I had never met or been examined by any Dr. Wilson. These weren't impulsive actions taken advantage of my hospitalization. This was a meticulously planned operation that had been in the works for over a year. While I had been cooking family dinners and reading bedtime stories to my grandchildren, my son and his wife had been systematically preparing to erase me from their lives after taking everything I had. The evidence of calculation made the betrayal even more painful. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a panic response to financial trouble. They had created fake medical evaluations, forged legal documents, and constructed an entire fiction about my mental state and living situation, all while looking me in the eye day after day. On the drive back to Eleanor's house, we passed my former home. Workers were installing a new fence around the property perimeter, tall and opaque, where the original had been open and welcoming. I turned away, unable to bear witnessing more changes designed to erase my presence. Eleanor, normally a cautious driver, suddenly pulled the car over, her expression grim. "We need to call the police. This is fraud, elder abuse, and theft. They're criminals, Christy. Your own flesh and blood has committed multiple felonies against you." The truth of her words was undeniable, yet something in me still hesitated. Criminal charges would mean publicly accusing my only child of despicable acts. It would destroy any hope of reconciliation, of ever seeing my grandchildren grow up. It would cement this nightmare as our family legacy. But as we sat in Eleanor's parked car watching more of my life being dismantled, I realized Thomas and Diana had already destroyed our family. They had chosen wealth over connection, convenience over compassion, and fraud over honesty. They had calculated that my love for them would prevent me from fighting back. They had underestimated the teacher who had maintained classroom discipline for 45 years. They had forgotten that before I was a grandmother, I was a woman who had raised a child alone after my first husband abandoned us, who had worked 2 jobs to put myself through college, who had nursed Jack through cancer before his heart finally gave out. They had stolen my home, my money, and my place in my grandchildren's lives, but they could not take my dignity or my resolve unless I surrendered them willingly. Looking at the evidence spread across my lap, I made my decision. "I'm not just going to call the police, Eleanor," I said quietly. "I'm going to fight with everything I have, not just for myself, but for every parent who has sacrificed for their children only to be discarded when convenient, for every grandparent kept from their grandchildren, for every senior citizen treated as expendable." Eleanor reached across the seat and squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's the Christy Williams who taught my boys. That's the fighter I know." As we pulled back onto the road, I felt something shift inside me. The paralyzing shock began to give way to purpose. They had made a serious miscalculation. They thought they were dealing with a frail old woman they could discard in silence. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The initial shock of betrayal gave way to practical horrors. When I attempted to use my credit card to purchase necessities, it was declined. My cell phone service was cut off 48 hours after I left the hospital. The medications I needed for recovery became unaffordable when I discovered my health insurance premiums hadn't been paid for 3 months. The carefully structured retirement that should have seen me through my golden years had been systematically dismantled. I tried reaching out to my grandchildren through their school, only to be informed by an uncomfortable principal that Thomas had updated their contact information and specifically instructed that I was not permitted to have contact with Lily and Jake. He had told the school administration that I was suffering from dementia and had become unpredictable, potentially even dangerous. The story of my supposed mental decline had spread efficiently through our social circle. Friends of 40 years became suddenly busy when I called. Invitations were rescinded. Church members who had brought casseroles after Jack's death now averted their eyes when they saw me at the grocery store with Eleanor. The few who asked directly about my situation seemed skeptical of my version of events. Thomas had always been so devoted, so responsible. Surely there must be some misunderstanding. Each dismissal felt like another small death. The community that had formed the backdrop of my life was accepting a narrative that painted me as confused or lying. Only Eleanor Doctor. Lawrence and a handful of others stood firmly in my corner, bearing witness to the truth of what was happening. 3 days after being turned away from my home, I met with Patricia Winters, an attorney Eleanor knew through her late husband's business. Patricia specialized in family law and had handled a few elder abuse cases. Her office was modest, but meticulously organized, much like the woman herself. She listened without interruption, as I explained the situation, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she removed her reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "Mrs. Williams, I want to be completely honest with you. What you've described involves sophisticated fraud. Your son and daughter-in-law have created a paper trail that on its face looks legitimate. Fighting this will be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining." I nodded, already aware of the difficult road ahead. "What's worse," she continued, "they appear to be well prepared. The fact that they filed for guardianship claiming you have dementia complicates matters significantly. The court tends to be cautious in these cases. They'll likely order independent medical and psychological evaluations." I sat straighter. "That should work in my favor then. Any legitimate evaluation will show imperfectly competent." Patricia looked troubled. "Generally, yes. But these evaluations take time to schedule. Meanwhile, your son has secured a temporary restraining order preventing you from contacting your grandchildren based on the same dementia claim. The order specifically cites concerns about your appearing at their school in a confused state. But I haven't been to their school since before my surgery, I protested. According to the affidavit, you appeared at the elementary school last Tuesday, disoriented and demanding to take Jake home. When staff refused, you allegedly became verbally abusive. The accusation left me speechless. Last Tuesday, I had been in the hospital recovery room, heavily sedated after surgery. There were medical records, nurses, and doctors who could verify my whereabouts. This wasn't just a manipulation of facts, it was an outright fabrication. I think they're accelerating their timeline, Patricia said grimly. Based on what you've told me, they probably expected you to be disoriented and compliant after surgery. When you showed up at the house instead, they had to move to Plan B. They're trying to establish a legal narrative of your incompetence before you can challenge their actions. Can they really do that? Create evidence out of thin air. Patricia sighed. Unfortunately, in guardianship cases, initial allegations are often taken at face value until they can be disproven. The courts err on the side of protection. By the time we get everything sorted out, they could have control of your remaining assets and legal authority to make decisions on your behalf. Worst of all, she explained they had already filed a petition claiming I needed to be evaluated for placement in a secure memory care facility. If granted, this would effectively remove my ability to challenge any of their previous actions. The world seemed to close in around me. As Patricia outlined our counter-strategy, we would need to file emergency motions, secure independent medical evaluations, and gather evidence of the fraud. The legal fees would quickly exhaust the small amount of cash I had in my purse and the single credit card Thomas hadn't yet managed to cancel. As weeks stretched on, my situation became increasingly precarious. Eleanor, bless her heart, insisted I stay with her, but at 82, her own health was fragile. She developed pneumonia 5 weeks after I moved in, requiring her daughter to come from Cincinnati to care for her. With the house now crowded, and Eleanor needing the guest room for her daughter, I reluctantly relocated to an extended stay motel on the outskirts of town. The Pinewood Motor Lodge was clean but depressing, catering mainly to traveling salespeople and families between homes. My room had a small kitchenette, a sagging queen bed, and a bathroom where the hot water ran out after 7 minutes. I paid weekly, watching my remaining funds dwindle with alarming speed. Patricia had managed to secure a court date, but it was still 3 weeks away. The temporary restraining order remained in effect, and according to Patricia's sources, Thomas and Diana were pressuring the court to expedite the competency hearing. Meanwhile, I had discovered evidence that medical records from my hospital stay had been altered. Notes about my clear cognition and appropriate responses had been amended to include observations of confusion and paranoia that never occurred. One night alone in my motel room, the weight of it all became unbearable. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the collection of pill bottles on the nightstand, the pain medication I had been rationing, the antidepressants. Dr. Lawrence had prescribed the sleep aids I relied on to get through the nights. In that moment of despair, I understood how people could give up, could see medication as an escape rather than treatment. Instead, I reached for my purse, searching for tissues. My fingers found something unexpected, a small envelope I didn't recognize. Inside were photos I had kept in my hospital bag, pictures of Thomas as a child, of Jack and me on vacation, of Lily and Jake at their last birthday parties. The nurse must have placed them there while packing my belongings. Looking at those images at the family that had been mine, something broke and reformed inside me. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about truth and justice. It was about my grandchildren growing up with the false belief that I had abandoned them or that I was mentally unstable. It was about Thomas living with the corruption of having betrayed his mother for financial gain. That night marked my lowest point, but also the beginning of my resurrection. I may have been knocked down, but as I looked at those family photos, I made a promise to myself. This would not be how my story ended. The next morning, I collapsed while getting dressed. The stress, inadequate post-surgical care, and poor nutrition had taken their toll. A housekeeper found me semi-conscious on the motel room floor and called an ambulance. In the emergency room, doctors discovered my surgical incision had developed a secondary infection. My body, like my life, was failing under the assault of circumstances. As I lay in the hospital bed watching a new round of antibiotics drip into my veins, I realized no one had contacted Thomas, despite his name being listed as my emergency contact. The hospital had tried the number on file, but it had been disconnected, a detail that spoke volumes about how thoroughly he had cut ties. Staring at the sterile ceiling tiles, I had a moment of perfect clarity. I had been fighting this battle all wrong, focusing on what I had lost, rather than on what I still possessed. Thomas and Diana had taken my home, my money, and my place in my grandchildren's daily lives. But they hadn't taken my mind, my determination, or my connections to people who knew my true character. I still had resources they didn't know about or couldn't access. I had former students in positions throughout the community, including legal and financial institutions. I had colleagues who had known me for decades. I had a sister in Oregon who, despite our differences, shared a lifetime of history with me. I had the truth which would stand up to scrutiny if given the chance to be heard. As the antibiotics began to take effect and my fever subsided, a plan started forming. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was taken from me. It was about ensuring Thomas and Diana faced consequences for their actions. It was about protecting my grandchildren from growing up with the example of their parents' criminality rewarded. It was about justice. When Dr. Lawrence visited the next day concerned after learning of my readmission, I asked him a simple question. If I were truly suffering from dementia, as my son claims, what would my behavior and cognition look like? What tests would show it? Dr. Lawrence looked thoughtful. True dementia doesn't come and go, Christy. There would be consistent patterns of memory loss, confusion, and cognitive decline. Neuropsychological testing would reveal deficits. Brain scans might show physical changes. Most importantly, there would be a documented history of symptoms developing over time. Precisely none of which existed in my case. And medical records, even altered ones, would show that no cognitive testing had ever been ordered or performed. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Thomas and Diana had built an elaborate house of cards. With the right pressure applied at the key structural points, the entire construction would collapse. They had overlooked something fundamental about me, something that would prove their undoing. They had forgotten that I had spent my life teaching children to stand up to bullies. They had forgotten that I had survived being abandoned by my first husband with a toddler and no job. They had forgotten that I had fought the school board for appropriate services for special needs students, and won. They had forgotten quite simply who they were dealing with. As I began to recover physically, I also began to gather my strength for the fight ahead. Each small improvement, each clear-headed moment, each demonstration of my competence and determination became another piece of ammunition in the arsenal I was building. They wanted a confused, compliant old woman they could shuffle off to a facility and forget. Instead, they were about to face the full force of a mother whose love had turned to righteous anger, a grandmother fighting for her family's future, and a woman who would not go quietly into obscurity. The darkest night had passed. Dawn was coming. My recovery in the hospital provided unexpected benefits beyond improved physical health. The second hospitalization created a new medical record, clearly documenting my mental competence, directly contradicting the claims Thomas had made. The attending physician noted specifically that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment, recording this observation daily in my chart. More importantly, the quiet hospital room gave me time to plan my counterattack. I had been reacting defensively, allowing Thomas and Diana to set the terms of engagement. That would end now. I used the hospital phone to make a call I should have made weeks earlier, swallowing my pride and decades-old resentment. My sister Barbara answered on the fourth ring, her voice instantly recognizable despite our years of estrangement. Our last conversation had been at our mother's funeral, a heated exchange about the distribution of family heirlooms that had seemed monumentally important at the time. Now, facing the systematic destruction of my own family, such squabbles seemed laughably trivial. When I explained my situation, Barbara's initial skepticism quickly transformed into outrage. Though 7 years my junior, Barbara had always possessed a fighter's spirit. She had built a successful real estate business in Portland after her divorce and raised 2 daughters as a single mother. She was not someone who backed down from a challenge. "I'm coming," she declared, brushing aside my weak protests. "I've got airline miles about to expire anyway. And Christy bringing reinforcements." 2 days later, Barbara arrived at my hospital room with a rolling suitcase and a determined expression that took me back to our childhood. She hugged me fiercely, then stepped back to assess me with critical eyes. "You look like hell, big sister," she announced. "But your mind is still sharp as ever. I can see it in your eyes. Now let's talk strategy." Barbara had already booked an extended stay vacation rental with 2 bedrooms where I could recuperate properly after discharge. She had contacted her attorney friend in Portland, who had connections with the American Bar Association's elder law section. Most surprisingly, she had reached out to some of my former students through social media, creating a network of support I hadn't known was possible. Among those former students was Michael Chen, now an investigator with the district attorney's office. He arrived the afternoon after Barbara, his once mischievous 5th-grade face, now mature and serious. He had brought Carla Rodriguez, another former student who worked for the State Banking Commission. "Mrs. Williams," Michael said, reverting to the formal address of his childhood, "what happened to you is unfortunately something we see more often than people realize. Elder financial abuse is a growing problem, but most cases don't have the paper trail yours does. And most victims don't have your resources and connections." I winced at being called a victim, but recognized the legal accuracy of the term. Michael outlined the potential criminal charges: fraud, financial exploitation of an elder, theft, forgery, and potentially insurance fraud if Thomas had filed false claims using my information. Barbara had also located a support group for seniors who had experienced similar betrayals. Through them, she connected me with Alan Parsons, a retired detective who volunteered helping elder abuse victims navigate the legal system. Alan became an invaluable resource, explaining the criminal and civil aspects of my case in clear, understandable terms. Word of my situation spread through the tight-knit community of former educators. My colleagues from the school district rallied around me. They organized a fundraiser to help with my legal expenses, collecting nearly $7,000 from teachers, administrators, and support staff who remembered my decades of service. Former students contributed as well, many sending notes recalling how it impacted their lives. This outpouring of support strengthened my resolve and provided practical assistance during the difficult weeks ahead. With Barbara handling logistics and Alan guiding the legal strategy, I could focus on building our case. We started with the bank. Martin Bailey, the manager who had initially spoken to me, proved crucial to unraveling the financial fraud. He personally reviewed the transactions on my accounts and identified significant irregularities. The woman who had impersonated me had presented identification, but the bank had surveillance footage of all transactions. The footage clearly showed someone who resembled me from behind, but whose face was kept carefully angled away from cameras. Martin also discovered that Thomas had visited the bank repeatedly during my hospitalization, each time presenting documents that expanded his access to my accounts. The timing corresponded exactly with my surgery and most heavily medicated days, suggesting he had deliberately acted when I would be completely unable to contest his actions. Meanwhile, Carla from the Banking Commission helped us trace the money. The funds from my accounts and the second mortgage had moved through several transfers, but ultimately most had been used to purchase investment properties in Diana's name only. They had effectively laundered my retirement savings into assets that appeared to belong solely to Diana, attempting to create distance between the stolen funds and their final form. Alan connected us with Josephine Hart, an attorney specializing in elder law who agreed to take my case through legal aid services. She immediately filed emergency petitions to halt the guardianship proceedings and submitted evidence of the fraudulent documents Thomas had used. My medical team provided sworn statements regarding my mental competence, directly contradicting the fictional Dr. Wilson, whose signature appeared on Thomas' documentation. When investigators attempted to locate this doctor, they discovered no physician by that name was licensed in our state or neighboring states. The address listed on the letterhead belonged to a vacant office building. Perhaps most damning was the evidence regarding the school incident Thomas had fabricated. The elementary school provided security footage from the day I had allegedly appeared disoriented. The footage showed no sign of me, unsurprisingly, since I had been in post-surgical recovery. More significantly, it showed Diana speaking with the school secretary, presumably laying groundwork for the false report filed later. With each piece of evidence we gathered, Thomas' carefully constructed narrative began to unravel. The documentation of my supposed cognitive decline was exposed as fabricated. The power of attorney form was proven to contain a forged signature. The property transfer documents showed clear evidence of fraud. Josephine filed a comprehensive complaint with the district attorney's office, providing organized evidence of multiple criminal violations. Michael ensured the complaint received proper attention, navigating it to prosecutors who specialized in elder abuse cases. Within days, the DA opened a formal investigation. Our civil case moved forward simultaneously. The judge, reviewing our emergency motion to halt the guardianship proceedings, was visibly disturbed by the evidence we presented. He not only dismissed Thomas' petition but issued a sharply worded order condemning the apparent attempt to abuse the guardianship system. The momentum shifted dramatically when we learned that Thomas had used company resources to create and notarize some of the fraudulent documents. An anonymous tip, likely from a colleague, prompted his accounting firm to conduct an internal investigation. Thomas was placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome cutting off a significant portion of the family's income. Diana, seeing the walls closing in attempted damage control through family connections, her parents, wealthy retirees living in Arizona, had initially supported their daughter's actions, believing Thomas' claims about my mental state. When presented with evidence of fraud, however, they distanced themselves both personally and financially. Diana's interior design clients, many from their social circle, began canceling contracts. The financial pressure intensified when the bank froze accounts associated with the fraudulent transactions. Josephine secured an emergency injunction preventing them from selling any recently acquired properties until ownership could be properly determined. Their credit cards were canceled as the fraud investigation expanded to include potential credit applications submitted with my information. Most satisfying was the call I received from Diana's brother. The notary wad facilitated the fraudulent documents. Clearly frightened by the potential criminal charges and loss of his professional license, he offered to provide a complete statement detailing his involvement in exchange for consideration during sentencing. His testimony would prove that Thomas and Diana had been planning this scheme for over a year, methodically creating false documents and establishing a fictional narrative of my cognitive decline. As our case built momentum, I received an unexpected message. Lily's teacher contacted me through Barbara, saying my granddaughter had been asking about me at school, clearly distressed by my sudden absence. Despite the restraining order, the teacher felt obligated to let me know that my grandchildren were suffering from this situation. This knowledge both broke my heart and strengthened my determination. Thomas and Diana had not only betrayed me, they had traumatized their own children by abruptly removing their grandmother from their lives. Lily and Jake deserved to know the truth, that I had never abandoned them and was fighting to remain part of their lives. Through Josephine, we petitioned the family court for supervised visitation with my grandchildren, submitting statements from medical professionals and character references from community members. The judge, now aware of the criminal investigation into Thomas and Diana's actions, granted limited visitation pending final resolution of the case. 6 weeks after being turned away from my home, I sat in a family services office waiting room, heart pounding as I anticipated seeing Lily and Jake. When they entered, both children looked uncertain, clearly having been told concerning things about me. Jake hung back behind the social worker, but Lily studied my face carefully. "Grandma, are you still mad at us?" she asked in a small voice. My heart nearly shattered. "I have never been mad at you, sweetheart, not for one single second. I love you and Jake more than anything in the world." "Then why did you go away?" Jake asked, edging forward slightly. "Dad said you were sick and had to live somewhere else." I chose my words carefully, mindful of the social worker monitoring our interaction and the need to protect the children from the full, ugly truth. "Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about what's best," I explained gently. "Your dad and I had a misunderstanding, and right now we're trying to work it out through special helpers called lawyers. But nothing about that changes how much I love you both." By the end of our hour together, both children were sitting beside me, showing me art projects and telling me about school. The social worker noted in her report that the children were clearly bonded to me and comfortable in my presence, another piece of evidence contradicting Thomas' claims. As we built our case methodically and relentlessly, I began to understand that this fight wasn't just about reclaiming what had been taken from me. It was about establishing truth in place of lies, justice in place of exploitation, and consequences in place of entitlement. Thomas and Diana had believed their careful planning, and my vulnerability would ensure their success. They had not anticipated the community that would rally around me, the professionals who would recognize the clear signs of elder abuse or my own unwavering determination to see justice done. They had stolen my home, my money, and temporarily my place in my grandchildren's lives. But in doing so, they had set in motion consequences that would forever alter all our lives, though certainly not in the way they had intended. The legal machinery once engaged moved with an inexorable momentum of its own. Thomas and Diana were about to learn that some betrayals carry costs far beyond what they had calculated. The day Thomas and Diana received official notice of criminal charges was unseasonably warm for October. I wasn't present, of course, but Eleanor witnessed the process server approaching their door from her porch across the street. She described Thomas' face draining of color as he accepted the documents, Diana appearing behind him with a crying Jake clutched to her side. The district attorney's office had filed multiple felony charges, including elder financial abuse, fraud, forgery, and theft. The evidence we had gathered proved too substantial to ignore or explain away. The carefully constructed facade of a concerned son protecting his mentally declining mother had crumbled under scrutiny. Financial consequences mounted swiftly. The bank's fraud department froze all accounts associated with the illegally obtained funds. The mortgage company initiated foreclosure proceedings on the second mortgage due to the fraudulent application. Thomas' accounting firm, after completing their internal investigation, terminated his employment for ethical violations and reported their findings to the state licensing board. Diana found her interior design business collapsing as clients canceled contracts, unwilling to be associated with the growing scandal. Her professional reputation, built over years of networking in our small community, disintegrated within weeks. The financial strain became visible in small ways. The gardening service discontinued the luxury car, replaced with an older model, the private school van no longer stopping for Lily and Jake. Through it all, I took no pleasure in their distress. These were still the father of my grandchildren, the son I had raised the family I'd sacrificed for. But I recognized the necessary consequences of their actions, the inevitable result of choices they had made, fully aware of potential outcomes. The court granted me limited but regular visitation with my grandchildren, supervised initially by family services. These precious hours became the highlight of my weeks. Lily and Jake were confused and frightened by the dramatic changes in their lives, but our bond remained strong. I was careful never to disparage their parents, focusing instead on providing stability and reassurance that my love for them was unchangeable. 3 months after being turned away from my home, the court ruled definitively on the property case. The judge voided the fraudulent transfer documents and recognized my legal interest in the property. However, the complicated financial situation with multiple mortgages and frozen assets made immediate resolution impossible. The property would eventually be sold, with proceeds divided according to legitimate ownership percentages after satisfaction of valid liens. This meant I would recover a substantial portion of my investment, but the home itself was lost. The practical outcome was less important than the legal acknowledgement that I had been wronged, that my contributions had been real, and that justice, however delayed, was still possible. Barbara proved an unexpected blessing during this challenging period. Our reconciliation, born of crisis, deepened into a renewed appreciation for our shared history and family connection. After the initial legal battles were resolved, she helped me find an affordable senior apartment in a well-maintained community nearby. The one-bedroom unit was modest, but sunny, with a small balcony, perfect for the container garden I established. Most importantly, it was mine, a safe space where I could begin rebuilding my life. Thomas and Diana eventually accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial. The terms included probation, community service restitution, and mandatory counseling. Neither would serve jail time or relief, primarily because of my grandchildren. The felony convictions, however, ensured lasting professional consequences for both, particularly Thomas, who lost his accounting license. The plea agreement also included a requirement for family therapy if I chose to participate. After careful consideration and consultation with my own therapist, I agreed. These sessions were painful but necessary, creating a structured environment where truth could be spoken and heard. In our third session, Thomas finally offered what seemed like genuine remorse. "I had convinced myself you would be better off in a facility with professional care," he claimed, tears streaming down his face. The money just made it easier to believe that was true. Diana remained more defensive, insisting they had intended to use some of the money for my care. The therapist challenged her gently, but firmly pointing out the absence of any evidence supporting this claim. Over many difficult sessions, layers of justification were gradually stripped away, revealing the simple, ugly truth they had wanted my assets, without the responsibility of my presence in their lives. Recovery from such profound betrayal doesn't follow a linear path. Some days I felt strong and forward-looking, finding purpose in volunteer work with an elder rights organization and reconnecting with former colleagues. Other days, grief would ambush me, leaving me breathless, with the magnitude of what had been lost, not just material possessions, but the foundation of family trust. My relationship with Thomas will never be fully restored. Some breaches cannot be completely healed, but we have established a cautious, limited connection maintained primarily through the grandchildren. I see Lily and Jake regularly now without supervision. They spend one weekend each month at my apartment, filling the small space with laughter, homework questions, and the chaotic energy of youth. Diana and I maintain a cordial distance. She attends family events involving the children but rarely engages directly with me. Her parents have made overtures, apparently disturbed by their daughter's actions, and eager to maintain a relationship with their grandchildren. I have accepted these gestures with grace, understanding that family connections, however complicated, remain valuable. The legal battles eventually concluded with a financial settlement that, while not replacing everything taken from me, provided security for my remaining years. More valuable than the money was the restoration of my good name and standing in the community. The false narrative of mental decline was conclusively disproven, replaced by recognition of my strength and resilience. Barbara decided to relocate, to be near me, selling her Portland home and purchasing a townhouse 15 minutes from my apartment. After decades of limited contact, we now have weekly dinner dates and attend community events together. Our shared experience of betrayal, her own daughter had attempted a similar financial scheme years earlier, I learned, has created a bond stronger than our previous differences. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, comforted by the thought of returning to my own space and beginning the healing process surrounded by my family. If only I had known what was actually waiting for me, I might have never left the safety of that hospital room. Most importantly, I've learned about the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. At 71, I began again. I created new routines, formed new friendships, established new purposes. I discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed, and accepted vulnerabilities I had previously denied. My relationship with my grandchildren continues to flourish. Lily recently confided that she wants to become a lawyer to help people like me. Jake asks thoughtful questions about right and wrong, clearly processing the complex family dynamics he's witnessing. I answer honestly but age-appropriately, emphasizing that good people sometimes make terrible mistakes and that forgiveness is possible without forgetting or enabling further harm. Today I volunteer twice weekly at a senior center, helping others navigate the complicated legal and financial challenges of aging. My experience, though painful, has equipped me to recognize warning signs and guide others toward protection. Each senior I help feels like a small victory against those who would exploit vulnerability for gain. Through this painful journey, I've gained wisdom I never sought but now value deeply. I've learned that family is defined not by blood alone but by actions, respect, and reciprocal care. I've discovered that legal protections for seniors exist, but must be actively utilized through careful documentation and transparency. I've experienced firsthand how quickly decades of trust can dissolve, and how challenging but essential it is to rebuild one's life after betrayal. Would I have chosen this path? Never. The pain of betrayal by those closest to me created wounds that will never completely heal. Yet I can't deny that this journey forced growth that might otherwise never have occurred. It reconnected me with my sister, introduced me to new friends, and revealed depths of community support I might never have discovered. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with Thomas. Reconciliation remains a possibility, but only with clear boundaries and demonstrated change. My door remains cautiously open, but my eyes are now fully open as well. For those of you watching who might be facing similar challenges with family, remember that trust should be matched with appropriate legal protections. Document financial arrangements, clearly maintain copies of important papers, and never sign documents without independent review, even when family members are involved. Love does not require blind trust, and caring for yourself is not selfish. If you found value in my story, please consider subscribing to this channel and sharing with others who might benefit. Your comments about similar experiences or questions about protecting yourself or loved ones are welcome and might help others in similar situations. Like this video to help it reach more people who need to hear that recovery from betrayal is possible, that new beginnings can happen at any age, and that justice, while imperfect, is worth pursuing. Thank you for listening to my journey. May you never need this knowledge, but be stronger for having it. Remember, our value isn't determined by how others treat us, but by our own courage in facing life's deepest challenges. Be well and be wise in whom you trust.